reason is that Papias, the bishop of Hierapolis in Asia Minor, anyone ever been to Hierapolis or Pamukkale? I have. It's an amazing place, lovely hot springs. But he writes this: Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately whatever he remembered of the things said and done by the Lord, but not, however, in order. Interesting, isn't it? So Mark is the interpreter of Peter. We see in Acts 2 that Peter's sermon to the people there gathered in the day of Pentecost has the same structure as the book of Mark. So that's a bit of a clue. But really, there's no reason not to accept Mark as the author. That's the best idea or theory that is out there of the book. Most people accept that. Which Mark? Well, we won't go into that. We assume it's John Mark that we see in the Gospels, but Mark was actually a very common name in those days. So what about the occasion of Mark? Well, things were getting tricky, to put it mildly, in the Roman Empire for Christians. There was a greater persecution happening. There was a fire in AD 64 in Rome, and Tacitus in his Annals writes these words: to scotch the rumour that the fire had been ordered by the emperor himself, Nero substituted as culprits and punished with the utmost exquisite cruelty a class loathed for their abominations, whom the crowd styled Christians. Christus, from whom the name is derived, had undergone the death penalty in the reign of Tiberius by sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate. Vast numbers were convicted, not so much on the charge of arson as for hatred of the human race, somewhat general charge. Every sort of derision was added to their deaths. They were wrapped in the skins of wild beasts and dismembered by dogs. Others were nailed to crosses. Others, when daylight failed, were set afire to serve as lamps by night. So things were hotting up or heating up literally for the Christians in those days. Now, Mark is written somewhere between 65 and 75. That's what most scholars recognise. Now, what event happened? What big event happened between 65 and 75 AD? What do you reckon? Someone other than Robert. Massive event. Bad. Terrible for the Jews. It's one of the reasons why that temple there is... yes, sorry, Nathan. Temple destroyed, Jerusalem destroyed, the Jews scattered, the Christians scattered, God's people smashed basically by the Romans, and never again occupy their own land in terms of sovereignty until, as we know, 1948. So a terrible, terrible time. So you can see in this situation that it was really important to begin putting pen to paper, as it were. They didn't have biros, but you know what I mean. As the apostles were being martyred, as the church was scattered, as time was moving on, they wanted to write these things down, and that's what Mark did with his gospel. So the purpose of Mark, and there's more lovely underlines here, is in the first verse. You know, the purpose of John is near the end, the purpose of Mark's right there in the first verse, just to help us. The beginning of the good news about Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. That is what this book is about. The beginning. Mark is talking not just, I believe, about verses 1 to 13, which is like the preparation for Jesus' ministry. I believe his whole gospel could be seen as an introduction to Jesus' ministry, because there's a lot more there, and we see more in Matthew, Luke, and John. But you know what? Mark has been used for 2,000 years, well, a little less than that, because it wasn't written until, say 70 AD, to declare the gospel of Jesus, and it contains everything that we need to understand and believe who Jesus is and follow him as Lord. It doesn't have all the stuff, doesn't have everything, but it has enough. It has enough. And it's a wonderful book. So the beginning. The good news. The good news, or the gospel of Jesus. And David Garland, in his excellent commentary, writes these words: in the religious world, the good news about Jesus Christ is watered down to good advice. People are told to be kind, to smile a lot, to love all creatures, to think positively, and to feel good about themselves. But the true gospel about Jesus Christ is something far more radical and explosive. It has to do with God's redemptive action in Jesus, which reveals God's love for humans and judgment on human sin and satanic evil. I like that quote because over the years, at times, the good news sometimes has been reduced to this kind of be nice to people, be kind to your pets and other animals, and to your neighbours, and so on. But it's far more than that. It's about God entering the world in His Son Jesus. It's about judgment on human sin and this incredible, explosive truth that God has made a way for us to be delivered from that through Jesus. So let's not think of small gospels here. Part of our goal, as always in church, I hope, in going through Mark, is to expand our awareness of what the good news is and who God is, who Jesus is. And just as our minds and our hearts are expanded, we're able to really follow Him more closely. So that's a bit of an introduction, I guess, to the book of Mark as we begin this incredible gospel. We're still doing the purpose. Jesus the Messiah means anointed one. As a king would be anointed to be a king. And the Jews, of course, expected a certain kind of Messiah, didn't they? And this is expressed very well in an exchange that Justin Martyr, an early defender of the Christian faith in the 2nd century, had with Tryphus, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, a rabbi. And listen to what the rabbi says to him. Trypho. Sir, Justin, Daniel 7 and similar passages of Scripture compel us to await one who is great and glorious and takes the everlasting kingdom from the Ancient of Days as Son of Man. But this, your so-called Christ, is without honour and glory, so that he has even fallen into the uttermost curse that is in the law of God, for he was crucified. And so for this rabbi, and indeed most of the Jews, they just could not get their head around a killed, crucified Messiah. For them, the Messiah would come and be glorious and victorious. And this was not what he observed in the Jesus that Justin preached. Of course, we know that Daniel 7 does. We believe that it does apply to Jesus, but not necessarily his first coming, his second coming, which will be far more glorious than his first, won't it? Quite an interesting quote there. And Son of God, this is not a title that Mark uses a whole lot. In fact, Jesus doesn't use this title of himself in Mark's Gospel. Others do. John the Baptist, a demon, and the centurion use it of him 3 times. He prefers to use the concept of Son of Man, which interestingly is in that Daniel 7 passage that the rabbi quoted. And one of the reasons for that is potentially known as the Messianic secret. The Messianic secret that we particularly find in Mark's Gospel. And so what happened often is Jesus would say to people, now don't tell, after he's healed them or something's happened, don't tell anyone about this. Which seems very strange to us. Why would Jesus say don't tell anyone? What happened usually after he told them not to tell anyone? What usually happened? They told people, didn't they? Didn't really work very well. But the Messianic secret can be, how I would define it as, Jesus tried to keep his identity a secret for as long as possible to avoid the crowd hijacking his mission or the authorities speeding up his fate. And he often uses that phrase, my time has not yet come. So he wants to give some space for his mission because it's not just going straight to the cross and dying and rising again. There's some stuff he wants to do. He wants to proclaim the good news of the kingdom, and he wants to train up some disciples who will spread it after him. And we're going to look at that whole that ministry that he has in the next few weeks. So, Son of God, I think. Yes, so we're now up to verse 2. That's pretty good. Verse 1, the gospel of Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. Verse 2, enter John the Baptist. John the Baptist. Now, he was the first divinely appointed prophet for 400 years. He was called by God. I believe the first one. There may have been others that claimed to be a prophet. He was a prophet of God. He was very closely identified with Elijah the prophet. And there's this great section in 2 Kings 1 where King Ahaziah, a king of Israel, falls through the lattice work in his upper room, and he asks his messengers to go and ask Beelzebub if he will recover. Now, Beelzebub was not the god of the Jews, but those in the northern kingdom weren't great at following the god of the Jews, and he was no exception. But on their way to ask Beelzebub, presumably prophet of Beelzebub, Elijah intercepts them. And he asks them, and he says this: "Is it because there is no God in Israel that you are going off to consult Beelzebub, the god of Ekron? Therefore, this is what the Lord says: you will not leave the bed you are lying on, you will certainly die." This was relayed to King Ahaziah. The king asked them, "What kind of man was it who came to meet you and told you this?" They replied, "He had a garment of hair and a leather belt around his waist." The king said, "That was Elijah the Tishbite." I'd know him, that description, anywhere. And of course, that's what John the Baptist wore as well. He was a prophet in that tradition of Elijah. He wasn't Elijah reincarnated, we don't believe in that. But he had the office, the role, if you like, of Elijah. In fact, at the end of the very last verse almost of the Old Testament says, "Elijah will come and my messenger will return." And so, as Jesus affirms, John is Elijah in terms of his office, preparing the way for the Lord, as Isaiah and Malachi say, as Samuel read for us. So John was a pretty unconventional character. He wore hair, garment of hair, leather belt. He ate locusts and wild honey. Not necessarily the sort of guy that you would invite to speak at church, although he wouldn't have required too much of an honorarium, maybe just a bit of locusts and honey. But he would tend to rile people up. He wasn't averse to offending pretty much everyone. And that's what prophets are like. They're good at that because they speak the word